8 to 10 a.m. and you're listening to Salam.
Right, so Zimbabwe celebrating 43 years of independence yesterday. I'll emphasize the word celebrating. Is there a cause to celebrate? It was once Rhodesia. A lot has happened from that period to where we are now. Let's find out more about where Zimbabwe is now and where it's heading with the Zimbabwean anti-sanctions activist, Rutendo Matinyarare. Rutendo, appreciate your time. Good morning.
Good morning, Ashraf. How are you doing?
I'm good
And
indeed, but yeah, happy. Sorry.
Eid. Happy Eid to
Well,
you.
you're in advance. You've got 3 days to go, so very much appreciated. Yeah. Well, I would like to say Happy Eid for Zimbabwe in terms of because Eid is really celebration. I'd like to think let's celebrate Zimbabwe's 43 years of independence. But do we do that? Should we do that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. There is a lot to celebrate in Zimbabwe. Now, first of all, we look at the aspects that Zimbabweans have become the most literate Africans on the African continent. Zimbabwe has been under sanctions for 23 years. We're still standing. The apartheid government fell after 6 years of sanctions. The Rhodesian government fell after 13 years. Zimbabwe has been under sanctions for 23 years, and they continue to go because we've learned to use our land. We've learned to use our mineral resources. And as you can see, the mineral resources and the boom that we're having from the gold rush is making a lot of Europeans and Westerners uncomfortable that they began to call it a gold mafia in a hope to try and ban our gold and a hope to try and close our financial system because they don't want Zimbabwe to succeed, but Zimbabwe is succeeding. But Zimbabwe is a tough country. It's for those people that are willing to build from the bottom up. It's not the kind of country for people that want to get jobs from other people. You've got to build the jobs. You've got to create the businesses. You've got to create the enterprise. And that's the people that are doing that in Zimbabwe are actually prospering. So we've made a number of billionaires, US dollar billionaires, Black Zimbabweans, and also non-Black Zimbabweans, other brown peoples. So we've got Indians that are doing very well there. And of course, white people are still doing well in Zimbabwe. And we keep saying to people, take advantage of the opportunities in Zimbabwe, take advantage of this independence that gave resources and factors of production back to the natives to help them to prosper.
Okay, so listening to you suggests there's no problems. Are there no problems?
Oh, we've got challenges like every other country on earth. But the challenges are magnified and over exaggerated in the media a lot of times. And of course, there are a number of Zimbabweans that also try to make it out to be what it is not. Zimbabwe is a country where if you're willing to wear an overall in order for your children to wear suits, you can actually make it. We are seeing a lot of people, no education, brought up in poverty, brought up in villages with absolutely no amenities, making it from the bottom to the top. The biggest gold buyer in Zimbabwe today is an uneducated young man who rose himself from being a gardener and actually overtook his boss, who was a white man called Mr. Macmillan, was the biggest buyer of gold in Zimbabwe. And now his gardener is actually a multi-billionaire who delivers $1.2 billion worth of gold to the refineries in Zimbabwe every single year after starting off as a gardener just 15 years ago.
Okay.
So these are kind of stories.
Okay, I mean, it's great that you identify that as a story. And of course, there are often stories of huge success, even in the most war-torn or poverty-stricken countries in the world. I mean, that does happen, right? But what you look at is a medium. Overall, are Zimbabweans in a much better space than they are now compared to where they were 43 years ago? Are they far more confident about their country? Are their standards of living much better? Are they happier? So I'm not talking of the individual. We're talking of the whole.
Yes, when we talk of the whole, Ashraf, when you look at Zimbabwe, it's got less poverty than South Africa. Now, we would say that South Africa is probably the most advanced country on the African continent. And so if Zimbabwe has got less poverty than South Africa, if Zimbabwe is managing HIV better than South Africa, where we've reduced our HIV by 98%, South Africa has increased by 38%. When we look at aspects like the number of people who own houses, the number of people in debt, Zimbabwe has got a less household debt ratio, if not almost zero, compared to South Africa, where almost everybody is indebted and most people can't even pay their debts. So these are the things that we look at. We look at business owners in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is not a country where you depend on employment. You depend on being self-sufficient. And being a part of the Muslim community or the Indian community, You guys know very well that you teach your children, you teach yourselves that it's important for people to start businesses. That is something that Zimbabwe is flourishing at. When you look at every technical aspect of industry, mining, fuel supply, gold mining, chrome mining, almost anything that you look at, Black Zimbabweans, native Zimbabweans are the ones that are running those industries. Banks are owned by natives. Insurance companies are owned by natives. And so this is the big transformation that Zimbabwe has gone through, and why it's become an enemy of the Western world is because Black people are being empowered. And that is then called communism, when factors of production are taken from a minority white elite to the majority Blacks.
Sure.
Then it's called communism. And then that's a lot of.
So if we say, many parts of the Zimbabwean wheel is working, right, then do we attribute that to leadership for a long period of Zimbabwe's independence, which was led by Robert Mugabe? I mean, that's certainly changed recently, but you still have the same political party or form of that in leadership. Do we attribute that to the political leadership, or do we attribute it to something outside the political leadership?
It has a lot to do with the political leadership that decided to fight and free the Zimbabwean people from colonialism using the gun. And after getting that independence, they understood that they had to develop human capital. So they created one of the best education systems on the African continent, building over 8,000 schools to try and get people educated and to do for themselves. And then when those people got educated, they began to demand more. And so they demanded the indigenization of the economy. They decided to demand that the land and the resources be put in their hands. And Zimbabwe got punished for that, got put under sanctions. But the leadership understood that if they develop enough human capital, and if that human capital can be able to work at home and can also go everywhere else in the world as it can, like what we see the Jews doing, like what we see the Europeans doing, that would also help to bring the country up to speed, because you would need investment to come in, and your own people outside and their skills are the ones that have become the biggest investors. And that's what Zimbabwe has done. There's been a deliberate thing, but it has been decampaigned. And then that decampaigning, Zimbabwe has not collapsed. It has continued to function because of the ability to develop its own people, to become its own investors, even when the rest of the world was shunning Zimbabwe. So I believe it was deliberate political planning, just deliberate leadership. I'm telling you about the healthcare system where we treat TB, HIV, COVID, and many other diseases even better than a country like South Africa with less resources. That is good planning, and I actually think that Zimbabwe hasn't gotten enough.
And yet, many people who may admire former President Mugabe and his sort of up your stance with Britain in particular, right, and admire that, and probably admire some of the work of his successors. There's also been huge amount of criticism, from within Zimbabwe or Zimbabweans about the autocratic rule of basically all the leaders of an independent Zimbabwe. How do you respond to that?
Well, we've always asked, what is autocracy? When you look at a country like Zimbabwe, all our urban metros are actually run by the opposition. That's the same opposition that went to call for illegal sanctions to persecute the Zimbabwean people, to force the Zimbabwean people to vote for that opposition. In many other countries, that opposition will be called treasonous, it'll be arrested. But in Zimbabwe, they're functioning, and they were functioning under Robert Mugabe. Then we look at violence. In South Africa, we have 3 politicians that are murdered every single month for over the past 7 years. In Zimbabwe, we don't have any political killings. It is just the media reporting that tends to portray Zimbabwe in a much more negative light than a country like South Africa, which is supposedly the democracy of Africa. But I actually believe that Zimbabwe has got more democracy than we see in South Africa. When you look at the fact that we do not have the murders of politicians, and even under Mugabe, we never saw politicians being murdered, and the opposition that was actually breaking the law, committing treason, continue to run municipalities freely. They continue to participate in our democracy. We had a unity government in 2013, illustrating tolerance in our political system, unlike the Western media and how it portrays Zimbabwe.
Okay, but I mean, just to stay with that, yes, there's been those historical attacks on white farmers, and if you want to change the word of my question, change it and tell me what it should be. So there's been people attacked there and murdered, and there's also been Black Zimbabweans who've been eliminated. I mean, I've heard many stories. I don't have them with me right now, but I've heard many stories, and they were politically eliminated. I mean, are we saying that didn't happen?
Well, let's put it this way. Look at how the Israelis portray the Palestinian struggle. They make it look like Palestinians are terrorists in their own country. And so we would look at the same thing for farm killings. Less than 13 white farmers were killed in the past 43 years of Zimbabwe's independence. But in South Africa, how many white farmers are killed on a daily basis? You know what I mean? So it's that kind of characterization that is wrong. And then we talk about these black Zimbabweans that are killed. We've always said that there was violence that happened in 2008, and it was violence between political factions. One political faction that called for economic warfare on its fellow citizens to remove a government that those citizens were voting for, and those citizens began to fight back. Some people would call that civil unrest, some people would call that political violence, but that is not something sanctioned by the government of Zimbabwe. That is why you don't have any ruling against the government of Zimbabwe by the United Nations Human Rights Council. That's why you don't have any investigations on that government for that reason. But let's look at, for instance, South Africa. It has been taken to the International Court of Justice for xenophobia. The deaths of 200 truck drivers from Zimbabwe within a 3-year period of time. We have never had those kind of deaths in Zimbabwe, but the media portrays it as if that is what Zimbabwe has done. It's this ungovernable state. There's more people murdered in South Africa in 3 months than the number of people that have been murdered in Zimbabwe throughout Zimbabwe's history.
Okay, so you're making a pretty convincing case for a person to live in Zimbabwe, but is that really the reality? We'll get an answer after this.
Somalia's worst drought in 40 years has left affected areas in desperate need of food and water. The crisis is impacting more than 6.7 million people, with more than 1 million displaced. Al Imdad Foundation is providing critically needed food, water, and emergency relief aid to drought-displaced families in the worst affected areas of Somalia. Donate now and help keep famine at bay. Visit alimdad.com or call 0861 786 243 for more information.
This Ramadan, spread the love with Sunshine D Margarine, the perfect addition to your seri table for spreading, baking, and cooking. Sunshine D is rich in essential vitamin A, E, and D, and is the tastiest way to get their day or night started. Sunshine D. Tastes nice, no lies.
Southern Africa Dawa Network is a non-profit organization striving to uplift the disadvantaged and empowering through education and Dawa. Donate to the SADN centers, the MA Motala Islamic Center, as well as our Islamic centers in Amoti, Imtalumi, Botshabelo, and Castile. Donate your zakat and lillah today. Contact Farooq Sheikh 076-321-0650, Yusuf Mohammadi 072-259-3457, or the SADN Head Office 031-304-8000. Our account, Standard Bank, account number 050-856-294 for your zakat, or 050-879-790 for your lillah. Dawah through education, education through Dawah, the Southern Africa Dawah Network.
Are you looking for a cross-border road transport company that is committed in achieving high safety standards, who is fast and efficient, and also excel in customer service? Gardi Global specializes in cross-border transport from South Africa to Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi. Gardi Global, situated at 10 Daniel Road, Benrose, Johannesburg. For inquiries, contact our trained staff on 011-614-3108 or email info@gardiglobal.co.za. Safe long haul into Africa is our business. Gardi Global Transport.
This is Salam Media, and you are tuned into the Ashraf Garda Show.
Reflecting on the state of Zimbabwe, 43 years since independence, so 43 years since Rhodesia, in fact, became Zimbabwe, and things changed. My guest is Rutendo Matinyarare. Rutendo, I asked you painted a pretty good picture of Zimbabwe. Of course, there's lots of checks and balances, and it's really up to the viewers to check out some of the claims that you make. But here's the thought, right? That would suggest that Zimbabwe would be a country that people would be flocking to. Now, the reality all over the world, right, is people tend to flock to countries that are relatively prosperous and safe. Let's start with South Africa. And I know there are thousands, if not millions, of Zimbabweans in South Africa. Why is that the case?
Well, South Africa is the biggest economy on the African continent. So if people are going to try and look for economic opportunity, they would likely come to a country like South Africa because it's bigger. A lot of the capital that was externalized out of Zimbabwe illegally during the periods of turmoil and the sanctions and the illegal sanctions on Zimbabwe has come to South Africa. So a lot of times there's been a gravitation towards where the capital has run to. And there's also people seeking opportunities in South Africa. But we all know that South Africa is probably the unsafest country on earth in terms of crime. It's got the highest murder rate. It's in the top 10 highest murder rates in the world. Cape Town is the worst with the highest murder rate in the world. But people flock to these places not because they're looking for safety, but they're actually coming to the wild, wild west to seek economic opportunity.
But I mean, isn't that the point? I mean, but isn't that the point? I mean, and I mean, I understand you made the comparison to South Africa, and really the purpose is not to talk South Africa all the time, but there's a lot that's wrong in this country, and you know that. But the point is that with all the issues of violence and some sense of instability in South Africa we're experiencing right now, very different world from 1994. Why then? Yes, they may look for prosperity. Yes, people want more money. They would still go to South Africa. And why would they not go, say, north to Tanzania, go to Botswana? But maybe more importantly, considering the goal you referred to earlier on, and the high levels of education and the businesses, why would they not stay put in Zimbabwe?
They wouldn't stay put in Zimbabwe for the same reasons why South Africans didn't stay put during apartheid in South Africa. There are sanctions in Zimbabwe. There's an economic warfare that's been happening for 23 years. So it's more difficult for people to make it there because they have to start their own businesses. They have to start their own mines. They have to start their own, farms. And many people don't want to do that hard work. They want to come into an economy where they can just look for a job and they can be able to prosper. But let's also put it like this. There's 5 million Europeans in South Africa. Are we suggesting that South Africa is better than Europe? There's 3 million Indians and Asians in this country. Are we suggesting that Asia and India are not as good as South Africa? No. People have moved here because there's easier opportunity, less competition. And that's what we have to take into consideration. A person to make it in Zimbabwe, it takes more competition. You're competing with people way much more educated than you. You're competing even to be a policeman, you need a degree. Now, if somebody doesn't have a degree, somebody has got a PhD, a diploma, wouldn't they be able to get a better opportunity in South Africa? They would. So most people would gravitate to a place where there's less competition, where it's easier to make it, where there's less difficulty to make it. That's why Europeans are here. That's why Europeans have left Europe. There's more Europeans outside Europe than the number of Zimbabweans outside Zimbabwe.
All right, I just want to put. I hear that, but I may argue that point that, I mean, you gave the examples of Europeans and Asians, and yes, yes, there's been migration, but they're not first generation migrants, right? Many of them are now 3, 4, 5 generations. So that's another whole conversation. That means the people who are living in these countries now, for them, Zimbabwe is home or South Africa is home. What I'm referring to in the Zimbabwean example in South Africa is these are first generation migrants to South Africa. They've come only in the last 20 years, or if not less, because of all the reasons you mentioned. Now, if you're saying it's true, then I'm going to suggest that besides owning your own business and being educated, that Zimbabwe as a country, as an economy, has therefore been unable to provide the basket that allows Zimbabweans to prosper within the country, which you and I both know must be first prize.
No, I don't believe that. Like I said, it's about competition. I'm not going to stay in a country where you have to compete more in order to make it. It's more difficult to compete because there's so many educated people, there's so many capacitated people. But I also spoke about sanctions. So we can't ignore the issue of sanctions and the fact that there's illegal sanctions on Zimbabwe. And a country with illegal sanctions is much more difficult to make it. However, I think it's an excuse when people who come from other countries come and they want to say, I'm 3rd generation, 5th generation. Why don't you go back as a 5th generation? Why don't you go back as a 4th generation? It's because it's easier to do it here. And it's much more difficult to go to Europe and make it. It's much more difficult to go to India and make it. It's much more difficult to go to the Middle East and make it. The same way that other people transfer from other places to South Africa, it's the same way Zimbabweans have done it. The only problem that I find is that when Zimbabweans do it, there seems to be indictment. Why are you coming as a Zimbabwean if Zimbabwe is fine? But why can't Zimbabweans go all across the world and compete? Why can't Zimbabweans go and make the Jews, for instance? There is no other people that have left their homes than the Jews or the Irish. But nobody indicts Ireland or Israel for people leaving those places. Zimbabwe is exactly the same. And the more
Okay, but
educated
I don't
people
think
become,
that's the case, Rutendo. I mean, just to be fair, I mean, I'm certainly not indicting them. I think diversity in terms of a country, I think, is critically important in terms of growth. That's why countries, they don't like their politics, but that's why America flourishes, because of the vast number of immigrants. I mean, that I'm certainly on side on. I'm really asking that question, and you're saying, why don't people go back to where they came from? I think logically, once people are in a country for 1 or 2 generations, those kids of those people, that becomes their country, and that's how it should be. So for example, I would not treat a Zimbabwean citizen, if they've got a child in South Africa and the next child, I'm not going to call them a Zimbabwean anymore. They have a vested interest in my country, in South Africa. I wouldn't want to do it any differently, right? But fine, let's move on. Just on the issue of sanctions, right? Just explain, for those who may not be aware, why was sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe, by whom, and what impact has it had?
right. The sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe were imposed after 2 issues happened. Number one, we had an invasion of Congo by its neighbors, the Ugandans and the Rwandans, and Zimbabwe sent its army there to stop that invasion and to stop the overthrow of Laurent Kabila and to stop the division of Congo into 5 separate states that would have been easier to loot for the neighbors and the Europeans that had sent the Rwandans and the Ugandans there. The Zimbabwe also then took its land at almost the same time. And so the Western world decided that it's not okay for natives to take back what is theirs. It's not okay for restitution in integrum and restoration to happen for natives. They decided to punish Zimbabwe so that it will not be able to use its land, its industry, and its mines, and so that it remains stagnant, hopefully get the current government overthrown and get a new puppet government that would come in and return land, minerals, and resources back to the former colonizer. It never happened. Zimbabwe was able to weather the storm. It almost fell apart in 2008, but Zimbabweans eventually got their act together. They began to understand that we can't wait for foreign investors. We've got to build a country. But one of the most important things that has kept Zimbabwe going at a time where its goods were not allowed to go to the world was this diaspora that has gone out, began to work, and has brought in investment. It is that investment, home-biased investment, that has kept Zimbabwe going. So it talks to the issue that you've been asking. Why are Zimbabweans leaving? The sanctions make people leave, cause people to be refugees, but as they've gone, they've worked and they've been able to bring whatever they're working for back home as home-biased investment, and that's what's able to make Zimbabwe's economy tick up. And in future, we're going to be able to see more businesses created by those local Zimbabweans that is going to allow less Zimbabweans to be leaving the country. And as we end these sanctions, which we're beginning to litigate in South African courts against banks that are closing Zimbabwean bank accounts, banks that are denying Zimbabweans loans, and we're also indicting the US president here to say, you are forcing South Africans and other countries, and South Africa is our biggest trading partner, to close our accounts and to implement your sanctions illegally. So come and answer in South African courts where there is a constitution that does not allow the punishment of people without trial, but your sanctions punish people without trial, and you force South African businesses and South African banks to implement your sanctions illegally. We're hoping that we will end those sanctions, and if we do end those sanctions, then Zimbabweans have got absolutely no reason to leave their country, to come to a country where it's easier to get it done, rather than staying in a sanctioned country and trying to make it happen there, when even the exports are going to be difficult to export and payments are going to be difficult to come back to Zimbabwe.
Okay, well, let's see if that happens. I certainly, as a South African, I want all our neighboring countries, and I would like to think Zimbabwe will feel the same, that all of us must be solid and prosperous, because that will ensure that the entire bloc, say the Southern African bloc, would grow, and that's just fantastic, right? But let's move on to 2 things, right? What for you then would, in the 43 years, what for you would you think of as the single biggest success story of Zimbabwe?
Well, the first biggest successful story of Zimbabwe is getting the education into the people. People are well educated in Zimbabwe. Literacy is very high. And that ability to empower people and to create human capital has been the most successful thing we've done. The second most successful thing we've done is that we have taken that education to learn how to do the things that matter. So we're not just academically orientated anymore. We've learned to use the land. We've broken the wheat production statistics of all time. We're only one of 2 countries that are wheat self-sufficient in Africa over the past 2 years. And we've also now become maize self-sufficient. We're expecting a bumper harvest and our biggest harvest of all time. So Zimbabweans have eventually learned to take that education, to turn it into production, to
So
turn it
practical,
into producing.
all
It's
right,
practical.
practical
That's
education,
correct.
right? What's the biggest failing in the 43 years?
The biggest failure for me as an anti-sanctions activist is the fact that we were not able to unite as a nation to fight sanctions quicker. And we ran the risk of always becoming another Libya, another Iraq, where those sanctions end up dividing the people, causing civil unrest, and allowing the Americans to invade. Fortunately, we've been able to come up in time to stop that level of degrading into civil unrest and resulting in a civil war. But we are a divided people. And until we come together, we are not going to be able to fix things as quickly and as best as we should. And the last thing is that we also don't tell our story. The Zimbabweans have not been telling their story. That is why there's a lot of misconceptions about what kind of a country Zimbabwe is. And that's why a lot of people, when they go to Zimbabwe, they get surprised to see that the Zimbabwe they see there and the Zimbabwe they hear about are two totally different things. And so Zimbabwe's failure to tell their story is a very big problem. And I think that is something that we need to do.
Okay. Lastly, you touched on this earlier. You spoke about gold as a huge success story in terms of Zimbabwe right now, right? But in the same sentence, you then refer to how Zimbabwe's role with gold manufacture and distribution has been framed incorrectly, and therefore you talked about the gold mafia, which I think referring to the expose from Al Jazeera, if I'm not mistaken, right? I mean, is that the case? What is your understanding of what is being discussed and exposed?
I think the first thing I would put is I think most people who come from Arabic countries, people who are Islamic in religion, understand the negative role that Al Jazeera has played to create conflict in that particular region and to mischaracterize sometimes the Islamic faith. And so this is one of the things that they've done in Zimbabwe now with our gold. We have got 1.5 million people involved in the gold industry in Zimbabwe. These are people that were previously unemployed, people who've now got employment because they've got either become gold miners, they selling gold, they're processing gold, they're somehow in the gold value chain. And so where we've got gold benefiting so many people, it's being mischaracterized as a gold mafia instead of a gold rush. Yet when the same rush happened in South Africa, the same rush happened in California, same rush happened in Australia, where a few Europeans were benefiting from this gold rush, it was called gold rushes. And it was said that these gold rushes are what developed those countries. But in Zimbabwe's terms, it's being mischaracterized that it is some form of exploitation. It is some form of thievery.
But do you
right
think
now,
that?
Zimbabwe.
But do you think that's really the case? I mean, I'm looking at the example of someone who's common to both Zimbabwe and South Africa. I'm talking about Cecil John Rhodes, right? I mean, Rhodesia is named after him. The, many of those gold diggers. I mean, you're quite right. The gold diggers of all those years. I mean, they were doing things illegally in other countries. What we're talking about now are democracies. We're talking about democratic Zimbabwe, a democratic South Africa. The terrain is very different. We can't treat the rules of today can't be the same rules of 200-300 years ago. So, for example, I mean, there's been toppling of statues for roads in South Africa. There's been calls for name changes under roads. So there's been a sense of like, what the heck was he doing in our country? So I take that part, but I'm going to the current situation. Do we really want to judge people of 2023 and 24 based upon what others did 200-300 years ago?
Yeah, the standards must be the same. If a gold rush was, if people taking gold illegally was called a gold rush, and now we've got Zimbabweans that are taking gold legally in their own country, and the majority are the ones taking that gold and benefiting from that gold, why shouldn't it be called a gold rush as well? If the illegal activity was called a gold rush, then the legal activity surely should be a gold rush at the least. Unlike calling it a gold mafia, and unlike trying to taint Zimbabwe's gold as something that is bad only because it's benefiting the majority. For instance, we still got Anglo-America still here in a democracy. We've still got a lot of these colonial companies operating, and they are still beneficiaries of a crime against humanity. And the proceeds that they continue to hold today are the proceeds of a crime and loot of a crime that was never returned in terms of reparations or restoration. Yet we all know that reparations are supposed to say they should have returned the unjust enrichment. But in Zimbabwe, we've got the common man benefiting. And because Anglo-America is not the one benefiting, we have a criminalization of this beneficiation of these resources and the benefit that these people or the natives are achieving from these resources. That surely is not right. And that surely is something that we should have a problem with, because it criminalizes natives controlling their resources, having ownership of their factors of production, but it legitimizes the colonizer colonizing and controlling our resources,
All
which
right.
I
So,
think is
so my
illegitimate.
last question before I wrap up. So, with regard to that, what for you is the biggest problem you are finding with the Al Jazeera, expose, right? Number one, and do you think that expose will harm the flourishing Zimbabwean gold economy?
The problem I have with the expose from Al Jazeera is that it was false. It tried to create the impression that there is a smuggling of Zimbabwean gold out of the country to the UAE. That is not a case, because Zimbabwe has just broken its record of submissions of gold to its government, and it has also been that if you understand the value chain, the moment that gold is taken out of the ground, it's taken out by artisanal miners who mine 60% of our gold, and they always sell their gold cash upfront at market rate, less 4%. So that money gets left in Zimbabwe. That gold can then not be taken out of the country without being smelted or without being refined, because it won't collect the best prices in Dubai. So once it's refined, taxes are paid. So at least 96% of the value of that gold is left in Zimbabwe. So by the time it goes out, the agent is taking that gold to go and retrieve the 4% that's left for them to have bought the gold in the first place. Right there, smuggling cannot happen under those conditions. In fact, smuggling becomes unlucrative if you don't refine, if you do not process it, if you do not pay taxes to get a certification to take it to Dubai, where people can buy it knowing the value of that gold. Then there is the commercial producers of that gold. It's very easy for our government to be able to measure what they're producing, because they look at dumps. They know that if you can take 2 grams out of every ton, they come and look at the dumps that you've got. They measure the dumps, and then they expect a certain amount of gold to come out of your mine based on the profile of your mine over the years. So they know what to expect out of these mines. So if there's any smuggling that's happening, it's very little, it's not lucrative. It's not as lucrative as going through the normal market, which pays our miners in US dollars at the price of the world price, less 4% for the quality of gold that a person takes out. So I think that the Al Jazeera didn't understand that. They tried to create a case of money laundering. But money laundering is when a crime is committed. It creates profits. Those profits are then brought into the legitimate banking system. And they said that was happening in Dubai. And it was a hypothetical scenario where someone was saying, I've got dirty money. They were talking to agents with licenses, and those agents were saying, if we want to clean your money to get it into this gold trading sphere, we are going to put your money in a bank account in Dubai, either the bank account that we open for you or a bank account that belongs to us. The laundering of that money is taking place in Dubai and not in Zimbabwe. But for some reason, they wanted to bring Zimbabwe in. And the reason they wanted to bring Zimbabwe in is to try and gray list the Zimbabwean financial system through the Financial Action Task Force. And my issue that I have with that is Africa should not be letting FATF tell us how we move around our money so that we do not compete. The brown world should not be listening to FATF, which was created by the G7, telling us how we should move our money around. Yet when they move their money for terrorism activities, when they move their money to Israel, when they move their money to other criminal entities across the world, and they do it in the drug trade, they're able to move their money through their banking system, and it's not called money laundering.
Well, let's leave it at that. Yeah, let's leave it at that, Rutendo. So I think lots to come out of that, certainly from reflecting on the 43 years of independence to where we are now about education and, of course, the issues of the gold. My challenge to people is we talk about Zimbabwe, 43 years to celebrate or not to celebrate, is to effectively check out all the claims that you've made and say, in fact, does Rutendo have a point or not at all? Is it so much more deeper than just what is being spoken about here? Rutendo, having said that, appreciate your time and thanks for sharing your opinions and your comments with us on this show this morning. Appreciate it. Goodbye.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you so much. And I would like to say to people, be careful that let's not have a negative outlook on Zimbabwe. Europeans are going there every day while we're scared to go there because we believe in the negativity.
Okay, the final word there, Rutendo. Appreciate your time, Rutendo Matinyarare. Right, let's move on from. Well, there you are. It's up to you. There's a whole lot of claims made. Okay, there's no time to challenge every one of them. My suggestion to you is watch the interview, listen to the interview, go and check it out. Come back with your own thoughts on what was said versus the actual in terms of what the guest that we had right now said today. Let's talk about the actual, the Masjid al-Nabawi in Medina right after this.